made. Our daughter, Odessa, we call her Des. Remember, Miranda said we spent 9 months on the road last year, California to Maine to Florida, back to California. So our 11-year-old, she passes a whole lot of time with an iPad. You know, all those hours on the road. And this is why I say what I do. I mean, between their cell phones and their tablets and their gaming systems, kids today are never more than one click away from being able to pretend to be almost anyone or to do almost anything. When I was a kid, if I wanted to play superhero, Mom did not hand me an iPad. She handed me a tattered old bath towel and a safety pin. Man, I'd wrap that towel around my shoulders, and Mom would help me get it pinned up tight, and hours of fun would follow. Now, kids today would get like 5 minutes out of that. The first 4 would be spent complaining about how lame it was. But we could make it work all day long, right? Isn't it true, though, that even as adults, we want to be heroes? I mean, isn't there something inside of you somewhere that wants to do something heroic, that wants to live heroically? That's what we're going to talk about. So if you haven't already found your place in Joshua 2, do find your place there. We're going to meet a woman who was totally a hero. She did something heroic. She learned to live heroically. From her life, we can learn 3 things that we can do if we are going to live heroically too. So let's just pray again quickly. Father, now as we turn our attention to the text, I do pray that you would speak to us through this old story. Even though it's an ancient story, Lord, we love that it's a true story. These are real people, real places. These things really happened. Not only that, but you're here in this place, in this moment, and you're going to speak to us, Lord. I believe that. I ask you to do that. We invite you to speak into our lives. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. The first thing we have to do if we're going to live heroically is we have to let go of the past. Look at verse 1. Now Joshua, the son of Nun, sent out 2 men from Acacia Grove to spy secretly, saying, "Go, view the land, especially Jericho." So they went and came to the house of a harlot named Rahab and lodged there. Now this is a generation after the Exodus. If you haven't read the book, you've seen the movie, right? The 10 Commandments with Charlton Heston. Maybe you went the animated route and saw the Prince of Egypt. Either way, this story takes place right after that story. So Joshua has succeeded Moses, the people have crossed the river, and they're ready now to conquer the land that God has promised them when they come to this place called Acacia Grove in the New King James Version. Now, if that place name sounds familiar, it totally should. It was there a generation before that the men of Israel, their fathers, were seduced by the women of Moab. Long story short, as a result of their unfaithfulness to God and their unfaithfulness to their families, 24,000 people died. I mean, that means that there were people who went forward without a husband, people who went forward without a son, people who went forward without a father, people who went forward without a brother. And you know that every year on an anniversary, they would be reminded. You know that every year on a birthday, they would be reminded. And you know for sure as they gather in this place where all of these things happened not so long before, they would be reminded about how the choices of one generation affect the next. It makes me think about how I've been affected by the choices that my parents made. And it challenges me to think about how the choices that I'm making are affecting my daughters. I have an adult daughter who lives in Fort Worth, Texas, and then our 11-year-old who's with us on tour, and now even a granddaughter. That's right, you're looking at relatively newly minted Grandpa and Mimi. We have a 1.5-year-old granddaughter, and if you're wondering if our tour is routed through Fort Worth, well, of course it is. We cannot wait to get to Fort Worth the first week of November and spend a whole bunch of time with them. But it challenges me to think about how my choices are affecting even them. So, you know, maybe your family of origin, isn't entirely different from mine. Is there something in your family, something harmful, something hurtful that has gone on way too long? Maybe generation after generation. See, in my family, that thing has been alcoholism. My dad was an alcoholic. Actually, if he were here this morning, he would probably describe himself as a recovering alcoholic, just because that's the language that lots of people use today. But I'm so happy to tell you that my dad's been sober for years now. Not before it cost him his marriage to my mother. And not before it very nearly cost him his second marriage. But to see the way he's put his life back together, I'm really proud of him. Like, his life is so much better since he stopped drinking. But it wasn't just my dad, it was his dad. My grandfather was an alcoholic. Now, I don't know about you guys. If you're like me, when you talk about a loved one, especially a loved one who's already passed, don't you try to picture them? Don't you try to see them in your mind as you remember them? And I have to be honest, I'm struggling to do that right now. Truth is, I could probably count on one hand the number of times I saw my grandfather in my whole life. And not for a lack of opportunity. He lived well into my adulthood. I should have lots and lots of memories of happy time spent with Grandpa. But instead, I can barely remember what he looked like. You see, he was like alienated from the rest of our family. He and my grandmother were married and divorced twice to each other. They were married, they got divorced, they got married again, and they failed again. So no doubt the failure of both marriages was due in large part to his alcohol abuse. It's not hard to think about what that meant for my dad. For my dad, that meant growing up largely in poverty, and it meant growing up largely without a father figure. I mean, think of the impact of those two things. When I talk about him and his brothers, my uncles growing up in poverty, they lived with their mother, my grandmother, who lived with her own mother, my great-grandmother, in public housing in San Bernardino, California, the projects known as Waterman Gardens. And you know that had to impact the way my dad raised me and my sister Cheryl. It's been some years now since my grandfather passed. I was still pastoring Calvary Chapel in Austin, Texas, the church I founded in 1991 and led for 18 years. I remember that it was during that season of my life because I was in California for our annual pastors' conference soon after his death. Like 2 months later, I was there for our conference. And I stuck around an extra day or two to see my dad in Orange County. So there I am in my dad's living room 2 months after he's buried his own dad. He's describing to me what it was like for him to travel to Stockton, where my grandfather spent his final years. What it was like to enter his house. What it was like to sort through his personal belongings. And just then, my dad asked me if I would wait right there while he went in the other room. When he came back, he was carrying a box. Now, I have a box like it. I bet some of you do too. Do you have a box? I mean, it could even be a drawer, but a special place where you keep like keepsakes, mementos. Maybe you've carried these things with you throughout your life. Maybe as you've moved from one place to another, even one state to another, maybe you've taken them with you. Can you relate? You have a box like that? So Grandpa had a box. And my dad, he carried it in and he took the lid off and he started moving things around inside the box and then taking things out one at a time. He took out a document. It was a divorce certificate from one of their 2 divorces. Then he reached back inside and took out a picture of my grandfather with my Uncle Bill on his knee when Bill was a baby. Bill was later killed in action in Vietnam. Then he reached inside and took out my kindergarten picture, and my 1st grade picture, and my 2nd grade picture. I was stunned. Even though I can barely remember my grandfather's face, he thought that my face had a place in his box. You know, I feel conflicted about it, even now. There's a part of me that feels really, really good that I made Grandpa's box. And then there's another part of me that feels really, really bad. And that's the part of me that realizes that whereas my box, and probably your box too, is a box filled with memories, his was a box filled with regrets. His was a box filled with reminders of all the things that he'd had but lost. Many of them, though not all, but many of them his own fault because of his alcohol abuse. A reminder of the things that he might have enjoyed right up until the end of his life, but instead didn't get to enjoy at all. And so whether we're talking about my grandfather's story or whether we're talking about the backstory to Joshua chapter 2, it's a reminder to us that there has to come a time in our lives when we say enough is enough. That it doesn't matter what has happened in our families or for how long or whether we ourselves have struggled in the same way as I have. We get to say that it stops here, it stops now, it stops with this generation, it stops with me. Can you feel the mood in Acacia Grove? And it wasn't even just that. There's another thing that's a throwback, and that's the spies. You notice that Joshua sent a couple of spies. A generation before, Moses sent 12. And if you know the story, you know that 10 of those spies came back with a negative report. 10 of those guys were like, there is no way we can conquer the land. Like, I don't care who God says we are. I don't care what God says we can do. There's no way we can do it. We shouldn't even try. 2 guys came back with a positive report. One of them was Joshua, by the way, and they're like, oh, we so got this. Like we're exactly who God says we are. We could do exactly what God says we can do. Why are we even wasting time having this argument? Like we should be taking the land right now. Come on, let's go. And sadly, as is often the case, even in a community of faith like a local church, the negative voices carried the day. And as a result, an entire generation was doomed to die in the wilderness. Their sentence? 40 years with time served. For the best part of 40 years, they were going to wander through the desert waiting for everyone of a certain age to die. That's a lot of funerals. In fact, we can do the math. If there were 1.2 million adults, which is considered a conservative estimate, and if they used every single hour of daylight to bury people, they were having funerals year after year, month after month, week after week, day after day, about 7 or 8 times per hour they were burying someone for 40 years. And you know that every single time another body slid beneath the sand, they would be reminded of what happens when we listen to the wrong voices. When we listen to anyone who says anything other than what God says about who we are or about what we can do. You know, a lot of people tell me that they can relate to that. In fact, some people say that like for as long as they can remember, like their whole life there have been people around them battering them emotionally with a negative message about themselves that is at odds with what God says. You know, for you it could have been a parent or a sibling. It could have been a teacher or a coach. It might have been a youth leader or a Sunday school teacher. In your adult life, it could be somebody that you work with or for. It might even be your spouse. But for as long as you can remember, you've been beat down by this negative message about you that's different than what God says. And so if that's been your experience, I am so sorry. It can be really hard to overcome. Isn't it true, though, that even if we don't relate to that, like if we don't relate to that at least as a lifelong thing, isn't it true that for all of us, our biggest struggle isn't with the story they tell us about us, but with the story we tell ourselves? You know how that goes, that little voice in your head that tells you you're not enough. You know, I'm not handsome enough, I'm not beautiful enough, I'm not tall enough, I'm not thin enough, I'm not intelligent enough, I'm not athletic enough, I'm not educated enough, I'm not trained enough, I'm not cool enough, I'm not spiritual enough, I'm not good enough. This is one more of those things where there has to come a time in our lives where we say enough is enough. You know, that going forward, we're not going to listen to anyone, even if it's us. We're not going to listen to anyone who says anything other than what God says about who we are and about what we can do. Can you feel the mood in Acacia Grove? And so with that backstory, we rejoin the narrative. It says that the spies were sent to gather intelligence, especially of a place called Jericho. If you Google Jericho and you get home, one of the first results that comes up is one that will tell you that the modern city of Jericho claims to be one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world. Now, I don't know about that. That's an interesting thing to talk about, to kick around, you know, over coffee at Starbucks or whatever. What we're most interested in is what Jericho was like in ancient times when our story takes place. And maybe the first thing you should know about ancient Jericho is that it was heavily fortified with not one, but 2 walls. Apparently, the king of Jericho had promised voters that if elected, he would build a wall. And Moab would pay for it. I don't know. They wound up with 2 walls. Whatever you think about walls in modern times, in ancient times, a wall really was a matter of national security. In ancient Jericho, a wall was the difference between a good night's sleep and getting killed in your sleep. Your wife raped, your kids taken as slaves. That's just the world that they lived in. But what would happen if after you built a wall, you ran out of room? Well, then you build another wall. So picture a second larger concentric circle. And the space between the walls, suburbs. Old Jericho, New Jericho. Now file that away because we're going to come back to it. But the spies, no sooner did their feet hit the ground in Jericho than they're found in the red light district. What? Like if you were new to the Bible, you would never see that coming. You know, if you came up to a page turn, you're like, I know where they're going to be when I turn the page. There's no way you would make that call. It seems like we've gone from talking about the world's oldest city to talking about the world's oldest profession in like a split second. How did that happen? How did we get here? Well, before you get the wrong idea, I think I should clarify. I don't think the spies were at Rahab's place to get under the covers. I think they were there undercover. The success of their mission very much depended upon not drawing attention to themselves. My guess is that as they traveled to Jericho that day, they joined or were joined by other people traveling to Jericho. They didn't tunnel into the city. They walked through open city gates. They followed the tourists to those parts of the city where tourists would go. But maybe we shouldn't be too quick to dismiss the value that they might have placed in Rahab as an intelligence asset. I mean, think of it. There's no telling who she knew or what. It was reasonable for them to think that she might have access to information that no one else they were going to get to talk to would have access to. It makes perfect sense to me that they'd want to talk to Rahab. And if there was anything inappropriate about their visit to her place, the Bible doesn't tell us so. But I love that the Bible tells us the truth about her, don't you? I love that for so many reasons. I keep promising across the country that I'll develop a message just on that, the reasons why that's awesome. Can I share just one? For the sake of time, we'll do just one and we'll keep moving. One reason why I think it's cool that the Bible tells us the truth about Rahab is this. In the culture at large, but not just out there, in here too, right? In these four walls, there's so much talk today about authenticity, transparency, vulnerability. And like so many other things we talk about at church, we are so much better at talking about it than we are at practicing it. If you've been in church for long, like I have, meaning that like me, you've had a number of church homes over a lifetime, then you're going to know where I'm going with this, because at some point you were somewhere when someone got brave. They found their voice. They told their story like Miranda did this morning. Or maybe they opened up and talked about, the ways that they were struggling at a particular time. Or maybe they even admitted to having some honest doubts about things that everyone else in the group, sort of took for granted. And then you watched in horror as the people around them shamed them, shushed them, and ultimately shunned them. And you learned very quickly that church is not always a safe place to keep it real, no matter what we say. But shouldn't it be? And again, if you were new to all of this, wouldn't you think that it would be? Like if I were a first-time reader of the Bible and I stumbled on this story where the hero is a prostitute, I would say to myself, thank goodness I am finally in a place where I can keep it real. Now, I'm glad that you guys are in a church that values as a distinctive part of its culture, grace. But what if we all found ourselves somewhere at some future time where that wasn't the case? I don't think we'd have to wait for somebody at the top to figure it out and fix it. I think we could fix it. Grassroots. If we all agreed to do two things. Number one, if we all agreed to be brave and tell our stories. And then number two, if we all agreed that when it was the next person's turn, we absolutely would not shame, shush, or shun them. We could transform culture wherever we found ourselves. Now, in fairness to Rahab, she may have done what she did as a matter of survival. Am I saying that what Rahab did was okay? No, it was not okay. Just like so many things that I've done are not okay. But we've got to put ourselves in her shoes for a minute. We've got to think about what it was like in the ancient world. Today we talk about equal pay, right? And I think most people would agree that we've made progress in our country. I think, too, that most people would agree that we need to make more progress. So it's so good that we're having that conversation and continuing to make positive changes. Imagine what it was like in ancient Jericho. If you were a woman in ancient Jericho and you were single, you weren't married, and if you didn't have family helping to provide for your physical, material, financial needs, you were in a battle just to survive. It's not like Rahab could just put on her career hat and reinvent herself. She couldn't jump on LinkedIn and start networking. The ancient world didn't work like that. So what I'm saying is that many, many times in the ancient world, and maybe more often than we suppose in the modern world, there were women so desperate to find a way to survive another day, another week, that they, thought about doing things or even did things that prior to that they never would have dreamed of doing. The other thing I'm saying is, aren't we learning that life is so much better when we take even 5 minutes to put ourselves in someone else's shoes before we decide that they don't matter, that they don't count, that they don't have any value, or even that we know everything there is to know about what they're doing or why they're doing it, because we don't. However upsetting it is for us to learn this about her, and it should be upsetting. It is, right? It's upsetting. However upsetting it is for us to learn this about her is not half as upsetting as it was for her to live it. Could Rahab live heroically? Well, not unless she let go of the past. Think of all the guilt from her past. Think of all the guys, all the hookups. Do you have a past? Do you have skeletons in your closet? You know, we all do. We've all done things that we're ashamed of. We've all done things that we're embarrassed by. We've all done things that we feel guilty about. But one of the biggest mistakes that we can make in life is when we allow guilt from our past to rob us of the future that God has for us. And you know why we do that? We do that because we don't get forgiveness. I don't mean that we haven't received it. I mean that we struggle to wrap our minds around it. We struggle to understand what it means when it says that God forgives us, or even that he forgives and forgets. If the Bible doesn't say that explicitly, it certainly says it implicitly. I love that Bible verse that talks about God dumping our sin into the sea. You guys know that one? I love it. In fact, I want you to get a visual right now. I want you to imagine that as I'm speaking, God is rounding up all of my sin. As I'm speaking, every sin that I've ever committed, all of Allen Rigg's sin, God's gathering it up. You guys should make yourselves comfortable. This could take a while. Wait for it. Wait for it. It's awkward, I know. It's my sin. Okay, he's got it. Now, he's dumping it into the Mediterranean Sea. I want you to picture the storm surge. Like beaches all around the Mediterranean are disappearing. Coastal cities are being filled with water as my sin sinks into the deep, dark depths of the Mediterranean in a field of bubbles and only finally hits the seafloor, sending silt in every direction that slowly settles until finally my sin is covered and no one can see it. And God himself isn't going to dredge it up because he promises not to. With that visual in mind, do you think there could ever come a time in your life or in mine when we are allowing guilt from our past to rob us of the future that God has for us, that God might look at us and say, I'm over it, why aren't you? Have you allowed a handful of guilty memories to control your life, to define you, to tell you who you are? Those things you feel guilty about, they're a part of your story, but they're not the whole story. God is still writing your story. And this is one more of those things where we get to say enough is enough. That going forward, I'm not going to live from this guilty place anymore. I'm going to live from this forgiven place instead. But it wasn't even just the guilt in her life. I think that there was hurt from her past too. We're going to learn in verse 13 in a few minutes that she did have family in Jericho. So it's conjecture on my part, I admit it. But is it not at least possible if she had family in Jericho, and if they weren't helping her financially, as best we can tell, if they weren't trying to rescue her from the lifestyle that she was caught up in, as best we can tell, is it not at least possible that they'd had a falling out? That she was hurt, that they were hurt, that there was more than enough hurt to go around? There usually is. Have you been hurt? In your life, is there like an undercurrent of anger, of bitterness, of resentment? You know, guilt or hurt is one more of those things, like guilt, that can keep us from the future that God has for us. And you know why? You know why we let hurt from the past rob us of our future? Because we don't give forgiveness. So guilt robs us because we don't get forgiveness. Hurt robs us because we don't give it. Have you guys ever heard that saying, hurt people, hurt people? That is so true. This is what you and me do. When we're hurt, you know, this is our posture like this, like, oh no, I'm not going to forgive you. You owe me. You owe it to me to be miserable for a long time. Like, you owe it to me to be miserable for the rest of your life. It gets so bad we're laying in bed awake at night. We're not counting sheep. We're telling ourselves stories like this one. We're like, I hope I never see them again. No, I hope I do, because I've got a thing or two to say to them. Like, what if I ran into them at the grocery store, the hardware store? I'd act like I didn't even know them. That'd be good. Well, no, because I got these zingers I've been working on, so I'd have to acknowledge them. So I'd go up to them and I'd say this, and they'd be speechless. It'd be awesome. Well, no, because I got more zingers, so they'd have to respond. So I'd go up to them and I'd say this, and they'd say that, and it'd be really stupid, so then I'd say this. Meanwhile, here they are at home. I mean, they don't even know we're thinking this stuff. Or worse, they know we're thinking it, and they totally do not care. This is why we say that forgiveness is a gift we give ourselves. When I forgive the person who's hurt me, it effectively ends any control that they have over my life. Now, if you've been hurt recently or deeply, here's what you're thinking right now. Who is this guy and who invited him? He doesn't know what they did. He doesn't know how much it hurt. Who is he to tell me to forgive? Maybe it would help if I differentiated between two things. There is a world of difference between reconciliation and forgiveness. I'm talking about forgiveness. Reconciliation takes two. For that reason alone, it isn't always possible. Now, you'll hear that in church. What if I were to add something that you won't hear as often in church? You ready for this? Not only is reconciliation not always possible, but it isn't always, not in every single last situation desirable. Take my dad's story, for example. For someone in recovery, there are some people that you just don't need to be reconciled to. There are some people you don't need to be connected to. Take Miranda's story. For my wife and for our daughter, reconciliation would not have been safe. But while it takes two to reconcile, it takes one to forgive. You can, I can, all by ourselves decide that we're going to let go of past hurt. Yeah, but if I forgive them, I'm saying that what they did wasn't wrong. I'm saying that what they did didn't hurt. No, you'd be saying no such thing. You know what you'd be saying? You'd be saying what you did was wrong. What you did hurt. But holding this relational IOU over your head is tearing me up, so I'm tearing it up. I refuse to lose even one more day of my life to this feeling of angst that I have lived with 24/7, 365 for longer than I care to admit, so I'm letting go of past hurt. Have you allowed a handful of hurtful memories to control you, to define you, to tell you who you are? Those things that hurt you, they're a part of your story, but they are not your whole story. God is still writing your story. And guys, it's one more of those things where we get to say enough is enough. Going forward, I'm not going to live from this hurt place anymore. I'm going to live from this forgiving place instead. To live heroically, we let go of the past. You know what else we do? And I promise we'll pick up our pace. We face our fears. Look at verse 2. And it was told the king of Jericho, saying, Behold, men have come here tonight from the children of Israel to search out the country. So the king of Jericho sent to Rahab, saying, Bring out the men who have come to you, who have entered your house, for they have come to search out all the country. Then the woman took the two men and hid them. So she said, Yes, the men came to me, but I did not know where they were from. And it happened as the gate was being shut, when it was dark, that the men went out. Where the men went, I do not know. Pursue them quickly, for you may overtake them. But she had brought them up to the roof and hidden them with the stalks of flax, which she had laid in order on the roof. Then the men pursued them by the road of the Jordan to the fords, and as soon as those who pursued them had gone out, they shut the gate. So the spies have been followed, they've been found out. Somehow or other, it came to this. Could Rahab live heroically? Well, not unless she faced her fears. Fear is such a universal thing. Like, everybody can relate to fear, right? Have you guys seen that website, phobialist.com? You'll have to check it out when you get home. Phobialist.com. They have cataloged over 500 phobias. It's like you're scared of stuff you hadn't even thought of yet. It's crazy. Anybody here afraid of heights? Yeah, so you're not even lifting your hand all the way up over your head, because that would be like too much. Anybody have like an unnatural fear of needles? Like, nobody likes a shot or a blood draw, but for you, that's a really bad day. Okay? And who has like an unnatural fear of spiders? For you, that's the real home invasion. Like, yeah? Okay, and who's afraid to raise your hand in public? You pass, you pass, you pass, you pass, you pass, you pass. I saw coffee in the lobby. I think there were pastries you guys should go and enjoy. Rest of us have a little more work to do. I mean, fear is crazy. I'm thinking of a picture of my now adult daughter, Lauren, when she was, much younger. I forget exactly how old. But she was at a stage where she was terrified of people in costumes, which is why I thought it was a really bad idea the year she wanted to celebrate her birthday at Chuck E. Cheese, where the whole point is to have someone in a costume come out to the table. So the picture was taken. I remember the moment well. I mean, it was right at that moment when the rat was stalking the birthday girl. And so, Lauren has jumped into Daddy's arms, and I'm holding her tight, and she's holding me tight. Her eyes, bigger than the pizzas on the table. Unbelievable. Whether it was Lauren's childhood fear of people in costumes or my nearly crippling fear of a coffee shortage, we've all got stuff that freaks us out, right? Like, think about how powerful fear is. Have you guys ever been so scared that you did something you wouldn't normally do? Totally done that. Or have you ever been so scared that you didn't do something you normally would do? I've totally done that. So powerful. Maybe that's why the most common command in the Bible is do not be afraid. Did you know that? There's a lot of commands in the Bible. There's more than a few do's and don'ts. The one that appears more than any other, do not be afraid. Now, we're going to come back to that. But first, I've been creating like this physical timeline, and I've been talking about guilt and hurt, as if they're over here in our past, Well, fear is usually over here in the future, right? We're afraid this is going to happen. We're afraid that's not going to happen. Don't make the mistake of thinking these things are disconnected. They're not. You know what I'm learning in life? Is that if I don't make peace with the past, I will almost always fear the future. And Rahab, she had every reason to be afraid. She was about to risk her life to hide the spies and to lie for them, which raises an ethical issue, right? Now, I don't want to spend too much time on this, so I want to keep moving along, but would you be interested in my take on whether what she did was right or wrong? I'll give it to you real quick. So here's what I would say. I would compare what Rahab did to what people in Europe during World War II did. People who took Jews into their homes and hid them. And then if Nazi soldiers came pounding on the door demanding to know whether Jews were present, they lied. They said no. They chose life-saving over truth-telling when it wasn't possible to do both. In other words, two moral absolutes came into unavoidable conflict, and they chose the greater good, I believe, without guilt. It's what Norman Geisler calls graded absolutism. If you want to Google it, read more about it. I feel that way about what they did in Europe during World War II. I feel that way about what Rahab did. Now, we can disagree about that and be friends, right? But at least I gave you something to argue about over lunch, so that'll be fun. That'll be a good time. You know, something to consider if we do disagree about this is that, God forbid, say we had like an active shooter situation this morning, and you managed to get out that door and to hide in the office. And so it was just me and the shooter. And the shooter said, "Is anyone else here?" I would say no and take my chances. Now, on the other hand, if I had managed to slip out that door and you were in the room alone with the shooter, and the shooter were to say, "Is anyone else here?" You go, "Yeah, that Rigg guy just went through that door. I'm sure if you hurry, you can catch him." So you should feel pretty good about hanging out with me. Me with you, not so much, maybe, but... Well, listen, if she had played it safe, she would have regretted it, right? Have you ever played it safe only to regret it later? Of course you have. Remember that time you struck out looking? All these years later, you're still like, "Oh, if only I'd taken a cut at that pitch." What about that time that like you knew the answer, but you could not get your voice to come out of your throat? That time that you wanted to volunteer, but you couldn't lift your hand over your head? That time that you couldn't make up your mind about the house or the car and someone else got it? Or that other time? You know the one. You were so close. You were crazy close to telling someone how you really felt about them. But you chickened out. And maybe you never had another opportunity. Rahab could have played it safe. She could have refused to hide the spies. She could have refused to lie for them. Instead, she risked the life she had, the only life she knew, for the life that she wanted. To live heroically, you always have to risk your life as it is. And that is so scary. That's why we're talking about facing our fears. Now, I can imagine the pushback. You're probably like this. You're probably like, "All right, Alan, this sounds risky. It sounds like you're talking about risk-taking. Do I look like a risk-taker to you?" Is that what you're thinking? Are you one of those people that would describe yourself as having a low risk tolerance or maybe no risk tolerance at all? I'm not buying it. Not for 1 minute. I was in a bookstore not that long ago. You guys remember those? They had shelves. They had these things with pages in them. Really cool. I liked them a lot. I took this one book off the shelf, and the title was "The 100 Most Dangerous Things in Everyday Life and What to Do About Them." Do not read that book. That book wrecked my mind. Like, I had no idea that every year in the United States, more people are killed by teddy bears than by grizzly bears. Who knew? Like a button can come off. You can have a choking incident. Did you know that every year in the United States, 40,000 people are injured by their television set? Yeah. Now, I have to admit, Miranda and I have been watching AFV, America's Funniest Videos, more than once and seen kids like roughhousing, rolling across the floor. They knock a piece of furniture that starts to wobble. The TV can fall off. You can have a crushing injury. Against my better judgment, I'm going to give you one more example. Did you know that every year in the United States, 60,000 people are injured using the toilet? Right? So don't tell me you're not a risk taker. Unless you're prepared to hold it forever. The question isn't whether to risk. We take risks all the time. The question is, what are we going to risk? So here it is. Will you risk the life that you have for the life that you want, the one that God wants for you? Or are you going to risk the life that you want, the one that God wants for you, to hold on to the life that you have? The idea is to face your fears. Like, what would you do tomorrow if you weren't afraid? In the verses we're about to read, Rahab uses fear words and phrases. Fear words in verse 9, fear phrases in verse 11. But by the time we get to the New Testament, it says nothing about her fear and everything about her faith, which destroys everything we think we know about heroes. We think heroes feel no fear, but Rahab was scared out of her mind, so what gives? Well, it must not be that heroes feel no fear. It must instead be that heroes feel fear, but that they refuse to be controlled by it. So let's think about that. Remember, the most common command in the Bible was do not be afraid. Say it with me. Do not be afraid, which means that there is a way of being where though we feel fear, like everyone else with a pulse, we refuse to be controlled by it. Imagine for you a life that's not continually controlled by fear. Thoughts not continually fueled by fear. Future plans not continually formed in fear. To live heroically, we let go of the past, we face our fears, and finally we believe. You ready to read a bunch of verses? Here we go, starting in verse 8. Now before they lay down, she came up to them on the roof and said to the men, I know that the Lord has given you the land, that the terror of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land are faint-hearted because of you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you, and you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites who are on the other side of the Jordan, Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. And as soon as we heard these things, our hearts melted. Neither did there remain any more courage in anyone because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in heaven above and on earth beneath. Now therefore I beg you, swear to me by the Lord, since I have shown you kindness, that you also will show kindness to my father's house, and give me a true token, and spare my father, my mother, my brothers, my sisters, and all that they have, and deliver our lives from death. Quickly, let your eyes fall on verse 11. We've got more verses to read, but just real quick. See verse 11 where Rahab speaks of one God, singular. Where she speaks of a personal God when she uses the personal pronoun your. Where she speaks of an all-powerful, everywhere present at once God when she refers to him as being, quote, in heaven above and on earth beneath, end quote. Guys, this is the language of faith. Rahab had come to believe as evidenced by the act of faith that follows. So picking it up in verse 14. So the men answered her, our lives for yours. If none of you tell this business of ours, then it shall be, when the Lord has given us the land, that we will deal kindly and truly with you. Then she let them down by a rope through the window, for her house was on the city wall. She dwelt on the wall. And she said to them, get to the mountain lest the pursuers meet you. Hide there 3 days until the pursuers have returned. Afterwards you may go your way. So the men said to her, we will be blameless of this oath of yours which you have made us swear, unless when we come into the land you bind this line of scarlet cord in the window through which you let us down. And unless you bring your father, your mother, brothers, sisters, all your father's household, so that it shall be whoever goes outside the doors of your house into the street, his blood shall be on his own head, and we will be guiltless. And whoever is with you in the house, his blood shall be on our head if a hand is laid on him. And if you tell this business of ours, then we will be free from your oath which you made us swear. And then she said, according to your words, so be it. And she sent them away, and they departed. And she bound the scarlet cord in the window. Now notice in verse 15, it says not once but twice that she lived on the wall. So I'm coming way over here just for a minute, because you and I are hanging out together, and we are on the approach to Jericho. We can see the inner wall. We don't care about that. We're focused on the outer wall where Rahab lived. Go home, check 3 sources, get 3 different descriptions. Here's one. We're looking at an earthen retaining wall that's about 15 feet high, and on top of that, a brick wall that's about 25 feet high. So you ready? With your eyes on Rahab's window, let's approach the wall together. So we're walking right up to it, right up underneath her window, and we're looking up, like 40 feet, right? Which raises a question. What in the world was Rahab doing with a 40 or 50-foot rope laying around the house? I mean, did everybody in Jericho keep a 50-footer on the coffee table? Did only people who live along the wall keep a long old rope on a hook by the window? I don't know, but I'm guessing these were not the first men to make a hasty escape from Rahab's place. Just throwing that little observation out there. Now, before she let them go anywhere, she wanted to have a deal. She wanted to make a deal with them, which raises a better question than the rope question, as entertaining as that is, at least to me. Why didn't she go with them? She could have led them to a cave in the hill country of Judah. Then when it was safe, she could have followed them to Acacia Grove. What if they didn't come back? Or what if they came back but didn't keep the deal? Or what if before they could come back and keep the deal, she'd been found out? They would have killed her for sure, right? Only one reason, her family. But wait a minute. That family that as best we can tell wanted nothing to do with her or she with them. Could Rahab live heroically? Well, not unless she believed. Not unless she believed in God. And we see her coming to faith in verse 11. Not unless she believed in herself, by which I mean the woman that God was making her. And not unless she believed in the future, her future, the future that God was forming for her. But not just for her. Not for her alone. The crazy thing is that Rahab had so many reasons not to care about anyone's future but her own. She had been overlooked by the eligible bachelors of Jericho. She had been used by immoral men from far and wide. She had apparently been abandoned by her own family. I mean, who would blame her for wanting to get out and for never looking back? It's what I would have done. Might be what you would have done too. But the idea is to believe God for a big future that makes us and others bigger. As Christians, don't we love to talk about the future? We talk about vision. We have like Vision Sunday at church, and we have books about vision casting, and we talk about having like a God-given dream. So if your God-given dream is only big enough for you, that's not God's dream for you. God's dream for you will always be so big that there's room in it for you and for others. And Rahab is the most amazing case in point. I mean, by the time you get to chapter 6, you discover that when the battle takes place, Rahab and her family were spared. And then just 2 verses later, we find out that when the book of Joshua was written, Rahab was alive and well and living as a part of their community. How awesome is that? Not half as awesome as this. Because you get to the end of the Old Testament, and then you turn through those blank pages between the Testaments, and then you turn to the first book of the New Testament, and to the first chapter of the first book, and to the first verses of the first chapter, and there you find a tree, but not just any tree, a family tree, and not even just any family tree, it's Jesus' family tree. This tree is so impressive. It has these huge branches going off in every direction, and on each branch is carved the name of a woman or a man who lived heroically. And on one branch for everyone to see, for me to see, for you to see from right where you sit this morning, R-A-H-A-B, Rahab. You know what that means, right? It means that not only had she become a part of their community, but that she'd fallen in love, that she'd gotten married, that she had kids who had kids who had kids, until finally one of her descendants was Jesus, God in the flesh, the Savior of the world, who many rightly see in the color cord she was told to tie in the window, that scarlet cord suggesting the blood that Jesus would one day shed on the cross to make all of this cool stuff that we're talking about possible. Oh my goodness. Clearly, Rahab had an unusual ability to believe God for a bigger, better future. But do you think that even Rahab could have imagined this? From prostitute to mother. How long? How long had Rahab worn a label that said prostitute? And God just comes along and takes hold of the corner of that label and listen, rip! And in its place, he puts a new label that says mother. Now, this morning, you heard a little bit of Miranda's story. She should be coming in any minute for our closing song. Let me just briefly tell you a tiny bit about mine. I was in a similar position 9 years ago, pastoring Calvary, Austin. The church I referred to earlier, the church I founded and led for 18 years, when my wife left me and our then 17-year-old daughter. For Lauren's senior year, it was just she and I until I sent her off to Bible college. And like Miranda, I lost everything. I lost my marriage. I lost my ministry. I lost all of my material things. I mean, I remember the day I returned my car. I remember the day I came home to find a foreclosure notice on the door of my house. Miranda and I both know what it's like to live a labeled life, what it's like to see the way people look at you, what it's like to see the way they whisper about you, what it's like to receive via text or email or Facebook message what people are brave enough to type from a keyboard. We know what it's like to live a labeled life. And God comes along and he takes hold of the corner of Miranda's divorce label. And listen, rip! And in its place, he puts a new label that says wife, my wife. And he takes hold of the corner of my divorce label and listen, rip! Tears it off. And in its place, he puts a new label that says husband. What label do you need to see and hear God tearing from you this morning? Failure. Rip! Loser. Rip! Sinner. Rip! And what label do you need to see him putting in its place? In just a moment, I'm going to say a prayer, and we'll get ready for that closing worship song. But before I do, can I make a suggestion as to what you might do when you get home this afternoon? Isn't that polite of me and thoughtful of me to plan your whole day for you? I want to suggest that when you get home this afternoon, you find a tattered old bath towel and a safety pin. And you wrap that towel around your shoulders and you pin it up close, and you begin to live heroically as you let go of past guilt and hurt. As you face your fears, feeling them fully, but refusing to be controlled by them. And as you believe God for a bigger, better future. For you, of course for you, but also for the people around you.
Thanks for joining us today. If you want to know more about having a real relationship with God, click the Do You Know Him link at westminstercalvary.org. We also would like to invite you to join us for our regular weekly services on Sundays at 8:30 and 10 a.m. or Wednesdays at 6:30 p.m. We are conveniently located on the northeast corner of Wadsworth Parkway and Church Ranch Boulevard in the Stanley Lake Marketplace Shopping Center. For more information, please contact our church offices at 303-223-4640. Thanks and God bless.
Blood.